So it will be a very difficult decision. I will look to the vote of the voters in our district. We should be able to see that very clearly, how each town voted for this measure. And I will, make a very considered decision. I will say that I would have an extremely difficult time implementing this type of measure that would have such dramatic impacts. I will add that my opponent made a very similar pitch to Holliston Town Meeting back in May to send a message to the State House about voting down an override for local school services. And this message vote, which in fact occurred, had very real results in our communities. It had, we now have $250 bus fees, we now have fees for middle school sports, and we lost a number of teachers. So there's no such thing as a message vote. Votes have very real implications, and we need to be careful and considered before we approve something that could have such dramatic impacts.
I'd like to respond to that, David, if I might.
Sure.
I'm glad Carolyn brought up the override in Holliston, because I did. It doesn't surprise me, frankly, that she continues to misunderstand what I said that day.
Sorry, I do want to interrupt. Because
sure.
We are going to get to that a little bit later.
Could I respond to this right now? Because that was kind of a frontal, and I feel the need to respond so that we don't run out of time and miss the topic.
But before we go on to that,
Okay.
I'm unclear on both of you right now.
Okay.
If the citizens vote yes for ballot 1, are you going to support the citizens or take a responsible act in the legislature?
Well, David, first of all, I continue to reject the premise. To me, the question's like, if Ralph Nader is elected president, what will you do? I don't know. That's not going to happen. But the point is,
but the listeners want to know.
No, but they ought to. But the premise is incorrect. They ought to understand the reality of the situation we're facing. This is my point. People are making a lot of noise about something that will never be implemented because it's in their interest to divert attention from the very serious problems we've got in this state that our one-party system created. And my opponent said time after time in our debates that she thinks we need to move away from assessing blame and talking about who's to blame and how we got to where we are and just all kind of join hands and move forward. We need to find out how we got where we are, and how we got where we are is very simple. The people who we elected to represent us made some terrible decisions. They ought to be held accountable for that.
Right, and there's 2 points I would make to that. The single-party system did not get the electorate so upset that they would draft their own initiative. There's no lobbying arm behind this. There's no political pressure. This is a citizens' initiative.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that. I think there's a cause and effect there, but who knows what motivates these things. I think it's rational to say that what we're getting from our government prompted this kind of reaction. But hey.
Right. Well, I'm just here to say that it's not the single-party system that drafted the citizens' initiative.
No.
And again, I've had this discussion with many people since I've been involved with this, and they all want to know, what about the will of the people?
Oh, well, but I thought I was pretty clear. The point I'm trying to make is this will happen before we are seated, what you're talking about. So this is, you're asking, in a hypothetical world, if this thing comes to pass, and in a hypothetical world, were we sitting in the legislature? I think I answered pretty clearly. I will always vote to uphold the will of the people, but we shouldn't be voting yes or no to uphold the will of the people in the constitutional initiative process. There is no role for the legislature in that process. It is not the proper role of the legislature to take that citizens' initiative and then step in and say, now do we say yay or nay? That's not how it works. And if they want that to be how it works, then they ought to amend the Constitution to give them a role in the citizens' initiative. But that's what I mean when I say to you that I reject the premise. That is not how it's supposed to work.
Okay. Carolyn, anything to add?
Sure. I believe that the voters will elect a representative who will act in their best judgment, or in their best interest, whose judgment they trust to evaluate all the information, all the alternatives, and make a decision that's supportive of our communities and will help us move forward. If this were to pass, the first thing I would do is, and the first thing I believe the legislature should do, is look at all possible alternatives for enacting it. Are there other ways to legitimately enact this legislation and move forward in a fiscally responsible way? If the only alternatives are to increase pressure on property taxes and further increase fees and diminish local services, These are issues that are already having such dramatic impacts on our communities. If that is the only opportunity, I would be very hard pressed to enact this legislation, and I would agree with Rick Lord of AIM, who suggested
Could I
just that.
do my follow-up that I was going to do a second ago? To the
Yes and no.
2.5 thing?
I want to set the table because I don't want this overlap to be uncomfortable for us later on. As I had suggested before at the top of the show, each candidate was allowed and able to ask the other candidate a question of their choice. Both candidates have been able to review and prepare for this, and when Dan had spoken earlier, he's actually touching on this. So if it's okay with you, I'll just rephrase the question, or I'll ask the question, and then this will be within the shadow of what you were trying to say, I believe.
Okay.
Carolyn wants to know, Dan, since you moved back to Holliston 3.5 years ago, there have been 8 town meetings that have addressed important issues, including school budgets, capital spending, overrides, infrastructure planning, and the institution of fees. Of these 8 town meetings, you missed the first 7, attending the 8th shortly after announcing you run for state office. Why should voters believe you will represent their interests at the State House when you haven't shown interest in their issues locally?
Well, I'm actually glad Carolyn asked that question, because she talks a lot about experience, and she talks about her experience working in our town government. And I don't demean that experience, and I don't ignore that experience. That's very relevant, worthwhile experience, and she should be credited for participating at the local level. I've done different things in the last few years. I've worked very hard at the state level in ways that made real differences in our state, in our communities. And I think that experience is relevant. Frankly, I think that experience is more relevant to the office that we are seeking at the State House, at the state level, than the experience that she's had at the local level, and that's fine. While she was working very hard at the local level to push through a wastewater bylaw that she talks about quite frequently as something that she's achieved, I was working very hard at the state level to push through Melanie's Law, which reformed our drunk driving laws and penalties in the state and has been credited with saving 46 lives on our roadways since implementation. Now, that's not a comparison thing. It's just I want to make sure voters understand that I have very significant experience at the state level. Part of my job as Governor Romney's deputy legal counsel was to review and analyze every single piece of legislation that was passed by our legislature. So it's not an exaggeration to say I have an expertise and I have knowledge in how the legislature works, the games they play, how they can help and hurt at the local level, and how things work and how they don't work in the State House. I think that's very, very relevant. To the kind of fundamental premise of the question, though, I grew up in Holliston. My dad grew up in Holliston. My grandfather grew up in Holliston. My family and friends network spreads deep and wide in that community and in our district. And, I don't want to get my back up too much, but I kind of resent the implication that because I haven't been a participant at town meeting, I don't care about our town's local issues. I think that's kind of an insulting thing to say, and particularly when people are very busy and people have things that they're doing on a day-to-day basis, and a tiny percentage of the town participates in town meeting, and that's unfortunate. But I very much doubt what Carolyn is saying to those voters, those parents and those seniors and those people who are dependent on local services who don't come to town meeting. I doubt she's saying to them right now that they don't care about our town's local needs and our town's local issues, and that they themselves would not be fit to serve at the state level were they to choose to do so. I'm surprised that in all the town meetings that Carolyn has apparently attended, what she's taken away is that people in our district want expansion of the tolls and don't mind higher taxes. That's not what I hear when I go around campaigning. But I guess the broader point is just, there are very different, we have very different realms of experience, and mine is significant. I've achieved a lot of things that I'm proud of.